painted depicting Fairhope. She did this for the centennial, and it looks very fuzzy with my bad eye, but maybe it's better on the camera. I hope. But it's really cute. And little boats on it. Of course, boats are a very important part of Fairhope. Rae, this is so cute. Okay, so we're on again, and I want to make one comment about Rae Jackson's table that is on the first part of this tape. It is a collage of the things in Fairhope, and I failed to mention that on her tape, so I kind of wanted to sneak that in on my tape. My name is Flo Schneider, and I'm usually one of the voices behind the camera, but today I want to do my little number, and so I'm going to talk about 4 people in my family, and in order of their appearance in Fairhope. My grandfather, Clement Coleman, was one of the Fairhope's founders. He came in 1894. My great-grandfather, George Warren Wood, came in 1897, and his daughter, Sarah Louise Wood, who came in 1901, I believe. And she married Clement Coleman. And then I'm going to talk about my years in Fairhope. C.L. Coleman, Sarah Coleman, and George Warren Wood are all 3 charter members of and signed the Declaration of Incorporation for the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation. One other family member I've just recently discovered was a member of at least of the corporation. He was George Hastings Wood, and he didn't live here, and he never did. I don't know if he ever came here even. Okay, Clement Lefevre Coleman. That's L-E-F-E-V-R-E for a middle name. He was referred to in most of the writings as C.L. Coleman, and they called him, I found out in later years, that everybody called him Clem. Everything I know about him has been told to me or I have read somewhere, because he died the year before I was born, so I didn't get to know him. Granddaddy Coleman, as we called him, was born in 1852 in Montreal, Canada. He died in 1932, as I said, the year before I was born. He's buried in the Colony Cemetery. He came to Fairhope, according to one newspaper account, on excuse me, November 30th, 1894, and met the group that had arrived 2 weeks earlier. His name was, oh, I said that, okay. His maternal grandfather, Clement L. Lefevre, was a Universalist minister, for which the family can claim a little freethinker status. And that's kind of important in our family. His father was a businessman in Milwaukee. Clem came to Fairhope from St. Paul, Minnesota. He was about 42 when he arrived here. We know that he had been married before he came here, and that he and his wife had a son, but the child died. I don't know what happened to his first wife. She didn't come to Fairhope with him. I can't get my voice cleared up. The Allye's book, Fairhope, 1894 to 1954, tells of some of Clem's contributions to the single tax colony as it struggled to get along. He had financial resources which allowed him to help out in a number of ways, including buying the first water pump for the community, which was placed in the intersection of Section Street and Fairhope Avenue. He was supposed to be reimbursed out of the first new membership in the association, or wharf certificates, whichever money came first. The association opened a cooperative store in which Clem operated, but the concept of an association store or cooperative store was just too socialistic for most of the single taxers, so they dropped that, and after that was closed, Clem took the lead in organizing the Fairhope Exchange, which the purpose of which was to facilitate the exchange of the colonists' products. But the exchange was not connected to the association, except that Clem was president of the association at that time. That was the Fairhope Industrial Association. Clem had dealt in real estate in the north, and although he appreciated the single tax theory, he decided to homestead a 40-acre tract of land just east of Fairhope, which is bordered by Fairhope Avenue on the north, Greeno Road on the east, Morphy Avenue on the south, and Ingleside Avenue, or street it is now, on the west. He built a large house in the middle of the property, which had a big fireplace in it, and named the place Ingleside, which means fireside in Old English. Clem loved the land and enjoyed growing things. It sort of runs in the family. On Ingleside he planted, and Ingleside is, to me, is a place rather than a street, because Ingleside was, we'd say, let's go out to Ingleside, and that, I knew where that was a place. And at the time I came along, it was a subdivision, and houses were in there, but it was still sort of a place rather than just a street. Okay. On Ingleside, he planted satsumas, persimmons, pecans, azaleas, camellias, and other things. I have a picture showing a long driveway from the gate on Ingleside east to the house with trees that looked like either magnolias or pecans on either side. He erected a sign at the entrance that read, "Visitors are welcome, trespassers are not. Picking flowers is trespassing." People tell me, I don't know who told me this, but years ago somebody told me that he walked with a cane, and he very often carried it behind his back and with it crooked through his elbows. So that gives me kind of a picture of how he strutted about town. Since Clem died before I was, died before I was born, and all I know is what people told me. In the 1950s, after Bob and I married, and Bob is behind the camera now giving me signals to stay in the frame, Bob's maternal grandfather, Charles Schultz, told me that he had bought 100 persimmon trees from Granddaddy Coleman, and when he got the trees, Clem, Granddaddy Coleman, was eating his lunch. Grandpa Schultz was fascinated because Clem was eating a lunch of sunflower seeds and raisins or some kind of dried fruit, which Grandpa Schultz thought was a very unusual lunch. The eating habits of the Coleman family, of eating lots of fruits and vegetables, preceded the present day recommendations by the health experts today. Clem offered Grandpa Schultz some seeds and fruit for lunch, but Grandpa Schultz respectfully declined. That was not the sort of lunch he was used to. Clem was probably into health foods because his health was not the best, although he lived to be 80 years old. I think he probably suffered from allergies and might not have, it probably made him feel terrible, but was probably healthier than he thought. In addition to his homestead that we call Ingleside, Clem also acquired the 40 acres on the northeast corner of Greeno Road and Fairhope Avenue, where the Plantation Point Shopping Center now sits. More about that later. That property is deeded rather than an FSTC leasehold. In 1902, Clem married Sarah Louise Wood. October 5th, 1903, my father, Henry George Coleman, was born. Now remember, Clem's first son from his first marriage had died. Then, during his first year of life, my father was diagnosed with spinal meningitis, paralysis, infantile paralysis they called it back then, or polio, or something else, I can't remember. Perhaps rheumatic fever, I'm not sure. The story my father told me was that the doctors gave up on him and told his parents to take him home and make him as comfortable as possible. Now these parents had, well, one of them, Clem, had lost one child. After they tried everything else, all the doctors and everything they knew to do, they turned to Christian Science. And his mother, Sarah, believed that it cured him. He did get well. And My father, who later adopted an anti-medical profession and anti-organized religion position, believed that leaving him alone saved him, that he just wasn't far enough gone to die. I have no record of what Clem thought about the whole matter, except that he believed in a healthy diet, a belief that my father also adopted. And he must have been grateful that he didn't lose another child, whatever the reason. In 1906, Clem and Sarah had a daughter whom they named Genevieve Coleman. She later changed her name by adding Marlene as her first name. And as a child, I remember being confused by her being called Genevieve by some and Marlene by others. She was married for some time but did not have any children. Sam Dyson told me recently that Clem's horse and wagon were always tied up under the shade of the tree, the same tree, every Sunday during church, and that was at the Christian church on the corner of Church Street and St. James, southwest corner. It's where the school is now, kindergarten school. Sam also told me that there was a black man who lived and worked on Ingleside, helping Clem with the grounds. Clem played the fiddle and called square dances. This black man who lived on the grounds once told Sam that Clem was the only one he knew who could fiddle and call and dance all at the same time. So I guess he was some kind of swinger. According to the Al Yates book, Clem served the association, that's the Fairhope Industrial Association, in several ways, including president, but he became a point of controversy. He and some of the others, including Dr. Clara Atkinson, who was a sister to E.B. Gaston, were unwilling to sell their land to the association at the rate that it could have been bought when the colonists first arrived. Allier writes that in 1905, Clem moved off colony grounds and never again served in an official capacity. I'm assuming that 1905 is when he moved into his home, Ingleside. In 1908, he was elected to Fairhope's first city council and stands behind Mayor Greeno in the official picture. Sometime between 1905 and the 1920s, Clem's and Sarah's home, Ingleside, burned to the ground. They moved to town at least by 1927 because I have a dated picture of the house they moved into, and it's dated 1927. That house was located on the southwest corner of Fells Avenue and Oswald Street, just behind where the Bell South office is now. Oswald ended just south of their house and was just a shady lane just past their house. Fells Avenue was paved only to Section Street when I was growing up, and their house was just beyond an empty corner lot on Fells and Section. I remember a wonderful mulberry tree in that side yard that I got many a snack from. In 1930, Clement wrote a book about some of the incidents that occurred in Fairhope during its early years, and he called it Educated Fools. He tells why in his book. In his prefatory note, he says the book is based on fact, but names are changed. In the book, he relates the story of a family whose child was very ill and almost died, but the parents turned to Christian Science, and he lived. So that sort of fits with his history and my father, but the other parts of the book contain events attributed to the same family that don't follow history. Clem died in 1932 after he suffered a stroke at his house on Fells Avenue. That house is now gone. George Warren Wood was my father's maternal grandfather. He came to Fairhope in 1897. Before he came, he had been a Presbyterian minister and a missionary among the Indians in Montana and Dakota. He left an autobiography which talks a lot about all those years and the 7 children he had. And it's been really wonderful to me to be able to go back and read about this person I never knew but was part of my family. He arrived in Fairhope in August of 1897, just before the epidemic of yellow fever in Mobile. He apparently came for 2 reasons: his interest in Henry George's theory and his health, although he does not say what his health problems were. He taught at a little school near Fish River the first year. A teacher had been obtained for the school, but was prevented by the quarantine from entering Baldwin County. In 1899, he left Fairhope and returned to Mackinac, Michigan, his health being improved, and when he returned to Fairhope in 1901, his daughter Sarah was the only family member who joined him here. All we know about his wife, Harriet Snyder Wood, is that she died in 1922. They had 5 daughters and 2 sons. I know that 3 of the daughters lived in Washington, D.C. until they died and worked in the federal government. George Wood became a member of the Fairhope Industrial Association and held the treasurer's position for 12 years. He was secretary of the corporation for 1 year. I think he was a compromise candidate after some discord among the colonists, and I think that was in about 1905. That was also the year Clem moved off colony land. In his autobiography, Great-Grandpa Wood writes that snow was on the ground on February 14, 1899. School was suspended, a tradition that continued through my childhood and perhaps through today, and the children had lots of fun. He writes that the Weather Bureau recorded 1 degree below zero, the coldest weather ever recorded at Mobile, and the only time he ever saw snow here. He lived here until his death in 1924. He writes of a January 1905 business venture in which involved bringing lumber to Fairhope by sailboat. He and his partner got caught in the bay in a norther with the water washing up over their boat and cargo and freezing on it. He writes, "I thought I was as near the North Pole as I ever wanted to be here on Mobile Bay." The next day they, quote, "had to chop away the ice with a hatchet and heat water in kettles many times to thaw the rigging, so we could weigh anchor and make sail." We don't have to do that now. We have the causeway and the bayway and lots of other ways to get to Fairhope. But boats were so important back then for all kinds of transportation for people as well as the goods that we needed here. In 1905, he was elected Secretary of the Colony. I believe I said that, okay. This is what happens when you have a computer. You forget to delete stuff. You add it somewhere else and then forget to delete it. Okay. Oh yeah, while he was secretary, the well-remembered and long-discussed fight broke out between Dr. Hale and Mr. Belangi. A fight that was continued the next day on the street. A full account is given in his autobiography, and I hope to leave the museum at least the part of his autobiography that pertains to Fairhope, the Fairhope Museum, that is. That's just now in its formative stages. This man, George Wood, was born in 1844, so he was 53 years old when he came to Fairhope in 1897. In 1904, he was 62. In that year, he bought a tent and lived in it for about a year until it disintegrated. Then he bought a house. He describes the hurricanes of 1906 and 1916, and in the 1906 storm, he stayed outside. His house, the windows all blew out in it, and he became afraid that he was going to be injured somehow. He's not real clear on it. And so he decides to go to another place, another house, another structure. He went to town, and I'm trying to remember. Well, I can't remember. I have to leave that in the writing. He's the person who was living there at the time. There were no lights on, and he couldn't imagine what no. I wish we could take this out, but we can't do that. Okay. You tell me what I said before about it.
He said he left his house and went to a neighbor, I assume, but the lights were out.
The lights were, that's right, the lights were out, and he couldn't, he didn't want to wake him up. He thought it'd be a shame if he could be sleeping through that terrible storm, that he didn't want to wake him up. So he stayed on the piazza. Now, that's an outdoor place. He said the wind was so strong at times that he had to hold on to the door handle to keep from being blown away. Now, I have my own thoughts about this because I love storms, and I think the old man wanted to stay out there. I think he had a good time out there. But anyhow, his story was he didn't want to wake the man up. And then he talks about the 1916 hurricane and how far up the water came in Mobile. He got caught in Mobile, and a number of people did, because the storm came quickly and there was no warning. My father told me that while Grandpa Wood was either treasurer or secretary of the association, he had need to do some business in Bay Minette, but he had no transportation. So he started out one morning and he walked all the way to Bay Minette. He did his business, and the next day he came back and walking all the way home. And my father said that he walked like in Indian style, putting one foot right in front of the other, for whatever that's worth. George Warren Wood died in 1924 at the age of 80 and is buried in the Colony Cemetery. Now my grandmother, Sarah Louise Wood Coleman. Sarah was the eldest of 5 daughters. She must have spent the better part of her childhood helping her mother with the housekeeping. She was the only daughter, only one of the girls who married. Her brother, George, married, but I think from his death notice that there were no children. I don't know about her other brother, so it is possible that my sister and I are the only descendants of George Warren and Harriet Snyder Wood. And my sister lives here in Fairhope, and she's been videotaped Anna Myers. Sarah came to Fairhope in 1901. In 1902, she married Clement Coleman. Clem was 50, she was 23. In 1903, my father was born, and in 1906, his sister. Daddy and Auntie were both educated in Mobile. I don't think it was a good experience for either of them. They, along with their mother, Sarah, would take the boat to Mobile on Sunday evening and live over there in a boarding house or a hotel or whatever until Friday and return home. In 1960, my father attended Principia in St. Louis. 1960, what am I saying? 1920, he attended Principia in St. Louis. Auntie also went to Principia to school, but I don't know if she attended. What did I say?
Auntie also went to Principia.
She went to St. Louis, but I don't know if she attended Principia or another school. My father was naturally left-handed, but at Wright School in Mobile, he was forced to use his right hand. And from the comments he made over the years, there were other pressures that left marks on both him and his sister. By the time I came along, Sarah, whom we called Nama, was suffering from arthritis, especially in the hips. She was on her feet until I was about 5 or 6 years old. Then she took to the bed permanently. I only have one memory of her standing up, and that was a time she was making donuts and giving my sister Anna and me the holes. I thought the deal was I would get a hole and Anna would get a hole. But I remember her giving Anna 2 holes to my 1, and I set up a big howl. Oh, I was just indignant at the unfairness of it. So anyhow, my other memories are times when I would visit her and spend the night, and of course she was bedridden by that time. Mother had talked to her about showing partiality to my sister, so she kept a good supply of cookies and candy on hand for me, and that kept me coming. I would go up there because my parents wouldn't let me have sweets very much, so when I went up there, she'd let me eat all I wanted. She had a live-in caregiver who was named Maggie, and she was a black woman whom I thought was wonderful. She was well educated, or seemed well educated. I thought she was when I was a child, and was always cheerful and kind to me. The next caregiver was called Boots, and I remember her to be rather sullen and cranky. But I surmised that since she lived in a building just behind my grandmother's house that was hot as Hades in the summer, that she had a right to be cranky. Sarah died in 1947 at the age of 69. Now, when I was a little girl, my name is Florence Coleman Schneider, and I was born in 1933. My family lived on the southwest, that's not right, on the northwest corner of Fells and George until oh, it is right, okay. This is terrible. Let's cut it, I'm not going to do this. Okay, I'm going to go on and do this. This is really bad though. I've made so many mistakes. We lived in the house on the southwest corner of Fells and George. And then when I was 2, we moved over to the northwest corner of Fells and George, and of course that's the only house I remember living in. My mother gave the house on the northwest corner to my sister and me when she was on up in years, and my husband and I bought the house. And we have it now, still on it. When I was about 5, this is one of my earliest recollections, Mother let me go down the street to the corner of Morphy and George. These were dirt roads back there. They were all sandy, and you could play in the sand. It was great fun. I loved it. So I went down there and played. And there was a little triangular park. There is a little triangular park formed where George Street, Cliff Drive, Morphy, and maybe Equity or something come together there. I remember one day Mother had let me walk over to Morphy Avenue to see a friend of hers for a few minutes, and on my way home I saw this goat in that little park, and he was just out there eating grass and minding his own business, but my imagination ran away with me, and I knew that goat was going to come get me and eat me up. I had it all mixed up with the Billy Goat Gruff stories. You never know what kids are going to do. Well, I managed to bury my head in the sand. I figured if that goat could not see me, then if I couldn't see him, then he couldn't see me. And if I buried my head, then he couldn't see me.
You were afraid of the goat?
So, I was afraid of him. My goodness, I just knew he was going to come over there and eat me up. Well, I heard somebody yelling, "Flo, Flo!" Had no effect on me, but it was Mother, and she finally walked down to the corner and pulled my head up out of the sand and took me home and cleaned me up, washed my hair. I can remember that so well. But she was annoyed, but she fussed at me a little bit, but I didn't care. I was rescued from that goat, and in my mind, I could not get past that corner because that goat was going to get me. Okay, the only kindergarten in town was the organic kindergarten. And since my birthday was in October, I was almost 6 when I went to kindergarten. So, wait a minute. Yeah, that's right. I was almost 6 when I went to kindergarten. Had to wait a year to go to first grade. So I went up there, and I stayed about 2 months, and I dropped out. So I like to tell people that I was a kindergarten dropout. I remember the Depression years only a little bit. My father worked anywhere he could. He worked at the Tom Dodd and Sims nurseries in Mobile. He loved gardening, and if he could have made a living at that, that's what he would have done. And for a while he was a barber in Daphne, and I remember that very well because I would go up there sometimes with him and spend the day. And even though I would get a little tired up there just hanging out at the men's barber shop, I did get to go out and play under the trees, and I'd have a doll with me and I'd play with that. And I behaved myself. Daddy also took us on bicycle rides down to Point Clear, and I think we went down to Sweetwater Branch, but I'd have to look again to see where Sweetwater Branch is to know if we actually went that far. Anna had her bike, and Daddy put me on the back of his bike. Mother used to take us down to the bay for breakfast picnics on the beach. And we loved that. And I don't see how she pulled all that stuff together and got it down there by 8 o'clock in the morning, but anyhow, she did. And my sister and I would dam up the little spring down there. There was a spring just south of where the duck pond is now, and I think it's gone. I haven't seen it lately. I don't know what happened to it. And anyhow, we dam it up and then wait for the water to break through the dam. That was more fun. I remember one year the bay froze enough so that we could walk out on it close to shore, and there was a real smooth place. It kind of sloped like that, and so we sort of run at it and skid on it a little bit. It's the closest thing I ever got to ice skating. Okay, let's see. I went back and forth from public school to organic school, and I remember that I was in the organic in 4th and 5th grades, in the 8th grade. And the 8th grade, you know, most people have put on these tapes all these marvelous memories that they've had of Fairhope. And I can agree with just about all of them, of the ones who lived during my lifetime. Because we had a wonderful place to grow up. It was just ideal, except that every now and then things weren't ideal. And when I was in the 8th grade, I was at organic school. And one day, the teacher got angry with the class and told us all to be quiet. I sat by myself in a desk, and the 7th grade students were in the class with us. This was the 4th life, I think they called it. And the 7th grade students, the girls, were all at one table, and they were sitting there having a wonderful time giving the teacher a fit. And she told them, she says, "You be quiet now, and I don't want to hear any more out of you." And I was not in on that thing, in that situation. I was not talking, wasn't doing anything wrong. I had a question about my work that I was doing, and I raised my hand. She said, "Don't anybody speak unless you raise your hand." So I raised my hand like this, and she looked at me and nodded, and I thought she meant that I could speak. And I spoke and asked her a question, and she backhanded me across the mouth. She knocked my braces out of line. Well, I got up, of course, and left the class and went home in tears, and had to go to the dentist because I was wearing braces, and she knocked them out of line. And Mother went up and talked to the principal and the teacher, and apparently she was just having a bad day. Well, that's okay. Everybody has a bad day, but nobody ever apologized to me. And I really thought somebody should have. Okay, that's one of the things that happened in Fairhope that was bad. We had other things like people dying. We've had people mention those tragedies, children diving into the bay or into the water and drowning, and then other kids in the gullies getting killed by digging out and climbing in the cave-like places. Now, we'll go back a little bit to the war years. I skipped over that. I remember mostly the blackouts that we periodically had.
What war was this?
World War II. 1941 to 1945. World War II. The sirens uptown would go off. They had a series of sirens. I think it was just over and over again for quite a time. And everybody knew to turn out their lights. So we turned out our lights. And my sister, who was in the Girl Scouts at that time, had gotten appointed as a block captain or something. Anyhow, she went out with a special flashlight that she had to hold down to the ground, and I forget how she did it because I never went with her. But she would go around the block and make sure that everyone's lights were off. And then she'd come back home, and we'd sit there in the dark until the sirens went off uptown again and gave us the all clear. The worst part of that was just thinking about preparing for war and preparing for bombs. And of course, my family had assured me that they wouldn't bomb a little town like Fairhope, that they would go after the big cities like New York and Washington and places like that. So I felt relatively calm. Oh, there goes the telephone. Would you push the pause button? Okay, so much for the telephone. The one thing I did during the war, I remember going down to I was a Brownie, and they recruited us to go down and fold bandages at the Red Cross building on Henry George Park. That building was moved later on, and I don't know whatever happened to it. Anyhow, we went down there and folded bandages, and I always wondered, even at the tender age of 8 or 9, what did they do with those bandages after we folded them? We had our hands all over them. How did they sterilize them? I still wonder. I'm sure they did, but I don't know how they did it. I remember the things that were rationed: sugar, gasoline, tires, leather, other things. Meat, that's right, meat was. I remember that Mother had to fill out a form for sugar to put up canned goods, telling how many pints or quarts she intended to put up. And she made things like canned peaches and figs and anything else that grew around here and put it up. Daddy had a garden, so we always had plenty of fresh vegetables too. Daddy was too old to be in military service during World War II, and in 1942, after the war broke out, he was hired by the Coast Guard and worked in the federal building in Mobile for 32 years. We had good bus service then. He caught the bus right in front of the house on Fells Avenue and went to work, and he came home the same way. Everyone carpooled to save gas and tires and other things, or they rode the bus. But a lot of times women would get together and shop downtown in Mobile, and nearly always they went together. That hardly ever did anyone drive by themselves. And the bus station was on the southwest corner of the first intersection as you come out of the Bankhead Tunnel. I don't remember the name of that side street. What is that side street? Oh well. When I was about 11 or 12, my mother started letting me go to the orthodontist by myself to get my braces adjusted. And I remember when they put that large, huge globe in the bank building in downtown Mobile, I had to go by it to the Merchants National Bank building, and so on my way home I'd stop and look at that big globe. It was absolutely fascinating. I never had enough time, and I always felt like the adults thought I shouldn't be there, but I loved to watch it. But I never did stay there very long because I was afraid somebody would come run me off. I think about going to Mobile by myself when I was 11 or 12, and I suppose a child would be safe doing that today. I didn't even let my children do it back in the 60s, and I certainly wouldn't do it today. I remember one other incident in Fairhope that really angered me. We had, to show you how much structure creeped into our beautiful liberal community, we had hall monitors in the public school for several years. I'm not sure how long, but anyhow, we started out, when we started, I stepped out the classroom door and took 2 steps the wrong way in the hall, and the hall monitor got me and turned me in, and I had to go to traffic court. And so I went, of course, and thoroughly humiliated because I had taken 2 steps in the wrong direction. So I went to traffic court, and my penalty was that I had to memorize the 23rd Psalm. Now, that doesn't happen anymore. Neither do we don't have hall monitors, nor do we make students memorize 23rd Psalms anymore. I can tell you that I had one clod fight in the gully. If anybody has watched any of these other tapes, people mention the clod fights in the gullies and what fun they were, especially the boys. Well, I had one clod fight, and a boy picked up what he thought was a clod and threw it at me, and it was a rock. It hit me in the wrist, and that was my last clod fight. And I said that was just too dangerous for me. too much pain. We used to go down to Big Head Gully, which is where I guess the subdivision covered bridge is now. I've sort of lost my sense of direction, but it looks like that might be where Big Head Gully was. And we used to have picnics down there, and Mother would take us, and a whole group, I remember groups of kids all getting together at our house and then walking down George Street to the gully. One thing nobody has mentioned that somebody brought up the other day is that when we went swimming in the bay, we used to love it when a large log would roll in. We would wait for it, wait all afternoon for one, and then play on it as long as we could before we had to go home. That was great fun. We didn't have plastic rafts and inner tubes and things like that. Well, we had regular car inner tubes sometimes, but not too often. But that was a lot of fun. That was one thing we did. Fairhope was a good place to be insulated from most of the rest of the world, and it's still that way. However, I think there was a time in Fairhope where people were looking to solve problems, to try to resolve the difficulties of the world. That single tax, of course, was a big part of that. Other people came here because of that, hoping to find a better way of life and to be able to have the freedom to do the kinds of different things that they did. We had people who, I hear there was a nudist colony in Fairhope. Joyce Bishop kind of burst my bubble on that. I don't know if it was a colony or if it was just a few people like to go without clothes sometimes. Anyhow, people like to do different things. I was in contact with people who had ideas about food and who wanted to eat more fruits and vegetables and be vegetarians and thought that was the way to go. But there were other thoughts, other ideas around too. That doesn't happen so much anymore. Most of the people who come here because Fairhope's a beautiful place to live and they want a part of the good life. And we do too. We enjoy living here on the bay. Didn't know much about racism. I knew that there was a difference between blacks and whites as far as what was in people's minds, but I never was taught to hate blacks, and didn't find out until I was in college that there was this serious problem. And then, of course, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education came down and everything hit the fan. Up to that point, I had no idea that people were as bigoted as they are. And I never knew a whole lot about women's place either, because my mother ran the house, but she also worked. So I just assumed that that was something women could do. It was never a question as to whether a woman had to stay home or go to work. But I found out later that a lot of people don't feel that way. In religious discrimination, I never knew of any religious discrimination as I was growing up. The only time I ever had any encounter with that subject was, well, I knew my family, my father's family, didn't like Catholics, but they didn't think they ought to be banished from the face of the earth. One of my friends was a school home student at Organic and lived in Maryland, I believe. And he said one day that where he came from, his religion, his religion there was a lot of prejudice against his religion. And so my answer to him was, or question to him was, are you Catholic? And he said no, he was Jewish. And that was the first I ever had any real contact with somebody who had actually, I'd heard about discrimination against Jews, but I'd never known anybody, and what was the big deal? So, pretty protected here in Fairhope. Okay, everybody talked about the casino, and I think it's been mentioned that it was not a gambling casino, it was a place to dance, and that was about all it was. And they sometimes served food from time to time. Whoever managed it would serve food, and we always could get a Coke or a drink in there, soft drink. It has been said by the older people of the town that it was the center of the social life in Fairhope. when I came along, we also had Burkell skating rink, the dances at the country club between Ingleside and Mershon, streets for teens. We had 2 theaters, the one uptown and the walk-in theater on the movie. And we had a bowling
at the beach.
What did I say?
Walk in at the movie. You had a walk-in at the
Walk-in.
Walk-in movie.
Walk-in movie at the beach, right. And we had a bowling alley on the side of the casino on the east side at one time. And then, of course, we had the bay and the beach, and we didn't have to pay anything for that at that time. And we used to go barefoot everywhere. I remember walking down Fells Avenue pretty much in the shade on the sidewalk. It was a sidewalk at that time on the south side. And across the park and down the stairs, down the bluff, and onto the wharf. Of course, the Rose Garden wasn't there at that time. And I'd walk in the shadow of the railing to keep the heat of the wharf from burning my feet. So, hot summers all the time. That's about all I have here that I can think of that I remember or people have told me. So I'll say goodbye for now.